je l'ai dit, en tout cas jusqu'au XXIe siècle, vous avez un livre en soutien, donc pas de panique. Okay, so we saw the very beginning of détente last time. I included Simon Serfati's quotation in the documents introductifs, so you have his whole quotation. And what is very important to remember is that détente was actually part of the Cold War. It was not a different policy. It was not a departure from the Cold War. It was just part of it. Another quotation that you have in the documents that I'm not showing right now, but you have everything in print, is Kissinger, who wrote that détente. S'il vous plaît, vous pouvez éteindre vos micros, merci. That détente was conceived as a relationship between adversaries. It did not pretend friendship. But s'il vous plaît, je ne sais pas si c'est Chloé, est-ce que vous pouvez éteindre vos micros? Merci. Okay. But of course, things were changing with the Vietnam War, and also everything we saw about the USSR, the Soviet Union, being now a full world power. And Washington was forced to recognize the Soviet Union as an equal. Also, another generation of leaders were in power, and they came to see the relationship between Moscow and Washington differently. And so they came to believe that containment, which was still absolutely valid, containment could be practiced differently, could be practiced by seduction, by cooperation, for example, and by also mutual interest. This is another idea that if countries, people have interests in common, they are less likely to wage war than if they have nothing in common. As you can see on, so I'm gonna share, I admit one more, and then I stop admitting students for a few minutes, just while I'm sharing the screen. No, I don't want this. So this is what I want. And you can see here that détente was significantly boosted by Willy Brandt, who was West Germany's chancellor, by his Ostpolitik, which in German means Eastern politic, that is, his politics, his policy towards East Germany and towards Eastern Europe. So you see, this was on the part of European country, it was a significant move towards cooperation, towards talk, more negotiations with the Eastern Bloc. And it is in this context that Nixon and Kissinger could follow suit with their own détente. The fact that West Germany was able to normalize its relations with the East, the fact that the Berlin issue was also normalized, or some solutions were found, all this paved the way to, I would say, a quieter relationship with the Soviet Union and with the Eastern Bloc. So I'm stopping to share it just to admit. Okay. So remember that in foreign policy, everything is interrelated. And what happened in Germany and in Europe resonated in the US-Soviet Union relationship. So this détente policy also was based on linkage. This is a word I wrote, but I'm writing it again. A linkage policy, a linkage theory, that is what I explained just a minute ago, very briefly, that the development of economic and political ties, such as trade agreements, for example, collaboration in technological. Tout le monde doit pouvoir voir ce que j'écris si vous cliquez sur converser, puisque j'écris à tout le monde dans la réunion. Donc, est-ce que c'est... Ah bon? Pourquoi? Pourquoi ça ne marche pas? Alors, tout le monde dans la réunion. Bon, alors je ne sais pas pourquoi, ça a marché jusqu'à... Non, s'il vous plaît. Je ne vois pas pourquoi. Alors, converser, j'y suis. Bon, vous ne voyez toujours pas linkage? Bon, alors là, je ne comprends pas ce qui se passe. C'est bien embêtant, puisque moi, je peux écrire, j'écris à tout le monde dans la réunion. Donc, je réessaye d'écrire linkage. Est-ce que c'est bon là? Ah, bon, ben voilà, je ne sais pas pourquoi, parce que pour moi, rien n'a bougé. OK. Sorry about that. So, as I was saying, linkage, the development of economic and political ties, such as trade agreements, collaboration in technological ventures. As I said, I'm sorry, it's now doing 10 times at the same time. Cultural exchanges, you see, so that was the whole gamut, from politics, from political meetings, to trade agreements, to technology, to science, to culture. And the idea was that all these exchanges, all these ties would be profitable to both nations and would remove the incentives for conflict or war, and would replace tests and threat. In other words, so for those who don't know where we are, we're continuing what we did last time, that is détente. Yes, it's still détente. Well, I mean, well, no comment. In other words, the basic assumption was that it would be more difficult for Moscow to attack, maybe not a full partner, but at least someone they had common interests with. Also, Nixon wanted to link all regional issues to what was called the grand design.
Alors, ok.
S'il vous plaît, est-ce que vous pouvez fermer vos micros? C'est insupportable, vraiment. So connect all regional issues to what was called the grand design, that is the Cold War, relations with the USSR. We already mentioned that it was not under Nixon, but the idea that Washington tended to see all events throughout the world, whether it was in Central America or in Asia, within the frame of the Cold War. So here you see it's more theoretical, if you like. A name is given to this, that is the grand design, is the relationship with the Soviet Union. And the idea is to diminish the Soviet Union possible threat, expansionism throughout the world, but at the same time to avoid having regional conflicts embitter the relationship with the Soviet Union. In terms of context, this policy also came at a time when Eastern European countries saw their economies fall behind those of the West. At a time when there was growing discontent among the civilian population in the satellite countries, so you see, I'm sharing again. In the satellite countries, that is the countries that were satellites to the Soviet Union, that is Eastern Europe. Remember that there was a strong rebellion in Prague in '68. The Soviets had to intervene militarily. And so there was some beginning unrest. And this was enough for Moscow to be interested also in deflating tensions with Washington. In other words, for all these reasons, and of course this is extremely rapid, but détente seemed to be the right policy at the right time for both Washington and Moscow. Détente was also applied to the Middle East. Both Nixon and Kissinger were initially reluctant to become involved in this totally volatile region, unpredictable region, which Nixon, and you have the word here on the screen, called a powder keg, in poudrière. Well, several reasons for this reluctance. First, because remember that the Vietnam War was still going on, and it was not only Vietnam, but it was also Cambodia, Laos, etc. And so Washington had its hands full elsewhere. And also because, and this is something we're going to see again with Reagan, they thought that the problems were intractable. And when you are a president of the United States, you want to be successful. You don't want to fail. And it seemed to be almost an impossible mission to be successful in the Middle East, to reach peace in the Middle East. So this, and Reagan had exactly the same attitude. In other words, initial reluctance. And what prompted Kissinger and Nixon to interfere was precisely the growing Soviet involvement on Egypt's side. We saw last time that Egypt had tried to get as much from the Soviet Union as from the United States, when it seemed that at the end of the 60s and early 70s, it was getting closer to the Soviet Union. And the regional conflict was deteriorating into a superpower confrontation. So, what came to be called the Nixon Doctrine called upon regional powers to maintain their own security with US military aid. In other words, a sort of local Vietnamization. We saw Vietnamization a few weeks ago, the idea that the US would provide the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, with the material they needed for their own security, for their own defense. But that would involve fewer and fewer American troops. So that's basically the same here, except that the US, that there were no US troops in the Middle East. So the idea was, okay, we will help you out with US military aid. It can be financial military aid or through the sale of armament, but your security is in your own hands, okay? Hence, we saw also a few weeks ago the pillars, who were the pillars of US security, US strategy, US policy in the Middle East. Remember, Israel, of course, but also Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so the sales of military equipment and also financial assistance to these three countries kept increasing. At the same time, talks were held to convince Israel not to go nuclear, to sign a non-proliferation treaty. Because, and I think this is something we mentioned last time already, if Israel became a nuclear power, the risk was high that other countries in the region would like to become nuclear powers as well. And you imagine the transformation from a powder keg to to a nuclear powder keg. So a kind of a two-level policy emerged both for the Soviet Union and the Middle East. More and more, public actions through the State Department. More and more public diplomacy, more and more negotiations. And at the same time, also secret back channel contacts supervised by Kissinger. Back channel, that is, that, and secret, that is, these negotiations were not official. They were secret, they were back channel. And Kissinger, this is what came to be called the shuttle diplomacy. So this is written here. Shuttle diplomacy between Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Moscow. And you see the link, because the idea was to be careful not to have Moscow expanding in the Middle East. There was back and forth movement between Cairo and Tel Aviv, the two super enemies, I would say, at the time in the Middle East, and Moscow. Moscow became a co-partner with the United States. Here again, you see the illustration of what I said earlier, that is, regional conflicts being treated within the larger frame of the bilateral relationship with Moscow and within the larger frame of the Cold War. This is also linked to some extent, okay? Remember that not everybody agreed with this idea within the US Department, and especially in the Department of States, where a number of diplomats were pro-Arab and thought that Nixon's policy probably favored Israel too much. So Nixon was not strongly pro-Israel in the first place, but what was reached was a kind of balance, and the idea was to give Israel and the Arabs as much the same thing, to give as much to one or to the other in order to be credible. Because if you outrightly favor one camp, you're going to be discredited with the other camp, and it will be impossible to negotiate. So this is this extremely fragile balance that Kissinger in particular, through his shuttle diplomacy, trying to establish. And what also is interesting is that Kissinger is a Jew, and he was extremely careful not to be closer to Israel, not to feel that his own religion played a part in his job, in his negotiation in the Middle East, and it worked pretty well. Other factors came into I'm just checking that nobody else is. Okay, I'm going back to sharing the screen with you. So other factors made these unusual negotiations possible. A time of Soviet restraint. Remember that, as I said, the Soviet Union was itself in a difficult position domestically and within its sphere of influence. Also, Sadat. Now, I didn't write Sadat. Okay, I'm going to do it now. President Sadat of Egypt, who was an extremely moderate person, at least in those days. and certainly helped the negotiation with Israel. Not everything was quiet at the time because the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, became increasingly radicalized, resorted to more and more terrorist actions. Which led to Israel's retaliation. And that leads to, we're not going to go into detail, but the so-called Yom Kippur War of 1973, in which the Arabs regained some of the territories lost back in 67. Given the fact that the Soviet Union was so strongly on the Egyptian side, it was difficult for the United States to refuse Israelis' demands for help. And there was a second phase in the war in which Israel accumulated victories and regained the lands lost in the first phase. So for all the detail, of course, you turn to your books. So you see, what is interesting for us is not the battles themselves, but the fact that in the middle of détente, in the heart of détente, the two superpowers were fighting by proxy, par procuration. That is, the US on Israel's side and the Soviet Union on Egypt's side. So this is what prompted Kissinger to start his shuttle diplomacy, because these wars were endangering détente, also because of the oil embargo decided by the Arab OPEC countries, an embargo on the United States, but above all on Western Europe. So this severely hurt US economy, but it also severely hurt Western European economies. And so a first ceasefire was negotiated. I'm skipping detail here. Shuttle diplomacy resumed for 2 more years until 75. And finally, Nixon was warmly welcomed in Egypt. And Egypt and Israel reached an agreement, that's the 1975 agreement, that provided for, and you have everything here on screen, that provided for eventual, that is gradual over time, not immediately, Israeli pullback from part of the Sinai, creation of a UN-controlled buffer zone, plus American technicians placed in the buffer zone to detect military activities, and Washington promising foreign aid to both Egypt and Israel. In 1980, the two countries, Egypt and Israel, received about one third of all American foreign aid. American weapons were used everywhere throughout the area for the first time. And the US displaced the USSR in Egypt. So there were only two countries that stuck to the Soviet Union, three countries actually, so let me write them. Three countries that stuck to the Soviet Union and remained two. Remember the distinction we made last time between secular countries and religious countries? So the three countries that stuck to the Soviet Union were all secular countries. They were, as you know, Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Egypt, which had been so close to the Soviet Union, was now closer to the United States, which could be seen as within the frame of the Cold War as a victory for Washington. So we can say that that there was no peace treaty, of course, but let's say that when Nixon left and Kissinger in 75 was still Secretary of State, the Middle East was more peaceful than it had been before. And probably more important is that there was no more war between Egypt and Israel. Doesn't mean that there were no wars at all, but no more between the two neighbors. Several problems remained, however, which explains why the Middle East issue is still not solved. The Palestinian demand for a nation was not met. So it was left on the side. The fact that Israel continued to establish new settlements in the occupied territories at the expense of the Palestinians, which sooner or later would lead to another conflict, and a civil war in Lebanon. A civil war in Lebanon, which started in 76. So, if we try to evaluate détente, the main achievements are clearly the opening to China in 72. For the first time, relations started being normalized. It took time. Full relations were fully normalized only at the end of the decade under Carter, under Jimmy Carter, but still, opening to China. Those were the first steps for the first time since 49, since it became a communist country. With Nixon visiting Beijing also, and with the recognition of this big communist country as a significant power. So this is to be remembered because this was something Johnson, for example, didn't want to hear about. De Gaulle had promoted this idea of that there's no way you cannot recognize such a big country as China. And this was a source of a bone of contention, I would say, between Johnson and de Gaulle. So Nixon was closer on a number of issues to de Gaulle on this, and thought that it had to be done. In addition, remember that the idea was also to establish a kind of triangular diplomacy. This is what you have here, triangular diplomacy, that is US, USSR, and China. And remember that the China card was also used to stimulate the Soviets to push for detente as well, because China and the USSR being neighbors, it was impossible for Moscow to accept a kind of, I wouldn't say alliance, but a normalization between Beijing and Washington that could maybe have, common ground, or talk to each other, with Moscow being left on the side. So you see how triangular diplomacy works with, it's not really you play one against the other, but there's some of it to it. That is, that clearly China was used as a way to uh, to push the Soviet Union toward detente and towards less expansionism. A second important achievement, more relaxed relations with the Soviet Union, with the signature of the strategic, this is written further down, so don't write it, SALT 1, that is Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in 72, in, and then SALT 2, which was negotiated under Nixon but not ratified. So the idea with these nuclear negotiations, nuclear but also arms negotiations, was to maintain a balance of strategic power slightly more favorable to the United States. Why? The two superpowers agreed, that is the Soviet Union and the US, agreed to maintain an equivalent number of strategic arms and missiles, okay? The thing is that nobody else on the Soviet side had a nuclear weapon, while on the US side, France and Britain were also nuclear powers, but they were not included in the agreement. So in SALT 1 and SALT 2, the idea was to maintain a kind of equality between the US and the Soviet Union. But it was only between the two superpowers, knowing that on the West side, there was a slight superiority thanks to France and Britain. So SALT 2, as I said, was never ratified. Because by the end of the decade, as we're going to see, it was a second Cold War again, and there was so much tension with the Soviet Union that Carter could not get the Senate, was not sure of getting a senatorial ratification. Let me see if... Remember that at the end of the decade, so that was really the end of detente. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. And the third consequence is a relatively more peaceful Middle East, as I said, no more war between Egypt and Israel. Now, if we turn to an evaluation, it is a mixed bag. Obviously, an historical turning point for China, an interesting attempt at managing the relationship with Moscow differently. Rather than confrontation, you see, it was a time of more cooperation and more talks. It also significantly reduce tensions in Europe. But it expected too much from linkage. It failed to end the arms race, for example. It failed to establish a long-term pattern of frequent consultation between the two superpowers. As we're going to see, there were many meetings under Reagan, but nothing was planned ahead. Nothing was scheduled. It was not a pattern of let's meet every year, for example. So it all depended on the rulers and what they wanted to do. You can turn, I'm not showing it right now, but you can turn to the quotations and you will find a quotation by Garthoff on the fact that détente failed to define a code of conduct also. It mainly ignored the third world and again viewed all events through the East-West lens. And Chile, that we very rapidly mentioned the other time, is a case in point. So according to Garthoff, who had an official position under Reagan, détente was a failure. Also, the fact that Nixon and Kissinger were also too secretive, did not take other analysis into account, including analysis from the State Department. And so you see a mixed bag with obviously positive points, but also more negative aspects, and certainly not an absolute victory, because in 1979, so I didn't write that, 3 historical events convinced the United States. So I'm stopping this and I'm go back to 3 historical events occurred in 79 that put an abrupt end to détente, even though détente
NP,
was
Gestapo officer a
diminishing
dit.
as time passed. The Iran Revolution, the Islamic Iran Revolution. Remember that from 53, 54 onwards, Iran had been a key ally of the United States in the region, a pillar of US policy in the Middle East, and all of a sudden, Iran became an enemy. So for more detail, turn to your books. Second crucial event, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. To support a pro-Soviet government. And the beginning of a war, not involving the United States militarily speaking, but a war between Afghan forces and Soviet forces, a war that started in 79 roughly and lasted until 89 for 10 years. And the third event that definitely made détente impossible was the rise of communist movements and governments in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua and El Salvador. That is, this time in the very backyard of the United States. So we're not speaking of we're not speaking of communist movements far away in Asia. We're speaking of countries that were in the immediate neighborhood of the United States. So all these events made it impossible to continue détente and gave way to a new cycle of confrontation in US-Soviet relationships. First, under Carter himself, remember that Carter became president in 77, who sharply shifted from conciliation to open confrontation. So don't believe that Reagan started it all, that it was détente in the 70s under Nixon and Ford and Carter, and then all of a sudden it was it was confrontation with Reagan. No, in the last 2 years of his presidency, Carter was also in a confrontational position towards the Soviet Union. And because it seems that Moscow had betrayed the United States by supporting Marxist governments in Central America, by invading Afghanistan, etc. The context itself, also Castro and Cuba. Castro was also more vocal and more confrontational, started operations in Africa, etc. So it seemed that the fragile balance that had been reached throughout the 70s was collapsing in the last 2 years of the 70s. And this, of course, paved the way for Reagan's counterattack, if I may say so. So I put plenty of documents online. Please turn to them in order to supplement what I'm saying. And because I really have to start Reagan now, please see by yourselves in your books the Camp David agreements under Carter. The last time a significant agreement was signed between Israel and Egypt, that is an Arab country. Again, just you see, it continued what Kissinger had done, but it certainly did not mean forever peace, as you all know. And again, you have more documents online and supplement with your books. So in this context, Americans had the impression that the US was failing everywhere. I forgot to tell you that even though this part is entitled The Ups and Downs of Détente and Human Rights Policy in the 70s, I'm not covering human rights policy in the 70s this year, even though from 74 onwards, from 74 onwards, under the leadership of the US Congress, the United States tried to sanction foreign leaders who were not respecting human rights. So that was valid particularly for South American dictators. But there was also not many, but decisions that were made towards the Soviet Union, but it was difficult because of detente, etc. So keep this in mind. The US Congress did impulse a policy, a human rights policy. Um, but again, with Reagan, it was a different story. So if I turn again to the screen that I'm going to share again over the next 5 minutes or so. So a big motto that spread during Reagan's campaign was America is back. That is, all these failures, Vietnam, but also, if you remember, domestic policy, the Watergate scandal, the Nixon's resignation, um, Carter, who, in spite of his very good intentions, was somewhat bullied by the communist camp. You see, it seemed that these 70s were horrible years in which the United States was bullied. And Reagan, based his campaign on we're going to be back again. America is back. You also had another motto. It's morning again in America. That should remind you of Donald Trump's motto, make America great again. So you see, you very much have the same kind of idea. That is, at a time when a lot of Americans feel despised, feel downtrodden, feel not respected, feel that status, domestic status, but status on the world scene is down. You see, a leader promising, a candidate promising the return of America as a first world power was bound to convince a lot of people. So a much more assertive and martial posture, and the idea that so much for negotiation, so much for cooperation, because obviously it didn't work, given all the elements I mentioned at the end of the 70s. Now Washington would negotiate from a position of strength. So the tone was clearly set in 83 when Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire, as opposed to the United States, the leader of the free world and leader of freedom. And you'll find a link on Amétis to part of this speech. It's called, or to this speech itself. It's called Reagan's Evil Empire speech. The next move was in 85 with the so-called Reagan Doctrine. It was actually a State of the Union address in early 85. And at the end of this address, Reagan focused on foreign policy, and in particular on arms control, on something new, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also called SDI. Remember this because we're going to see that President George W. Bush tried to resurrect it. Strategic Defense Initiative was, in just one word, the idea that a kind of up in the skies, in space, a kind of net, protective net would be established that would make it impossible for Soviet missiles to attack a Western country. Now, of course, you understand that the Soviets didn't accept this because they couldn't have their own safety net, if I may say so. They couldn't have their own SDI. And so it was unfair, and it was in contradiction with SALT I, SALT II, that tried to establish a kind of equity between the two superpowers. So that was the big aspect of the so-called Reagan doctrine, and also, as we'll see, support of freedom fighters throughout the world, les combattants de la liberté. Alors, je vais devoir m'arrêter là. Vous avez plein de citations, de discours à lire par vous-même. Je n'ai pas eu le temps de vous montrer, attendez, je vais peut-être ce document que j'aimerais, qui est sur Améthyste, donc vous avez tout le temps de le regarder. Bon, je voudrais juste le faire tourner. Ah. Voilà. Voilà. Vous voyez, j'essaye de l'agrandir. Vous l'avez sur Améthyste. On ne peut pas dire, donc 0, c'est neutre. Il n'y a rien de négatif entre Moscou et Washington. Tout ce qui est en dessous de 0, ce sont les périodes de crise. Tout ce qui est au-dessus de 0, ce sont les périodes de coopération. Donc, on ne peut pas dire qu'avant la détente, il n'y avait pas eu de coopération. Vous voyez, il y a eu plusieurs moments de coopération. Mais vous voyez qu'à partir de 70, vous n'avez, et jusqu'à la fin des années 70, c'est-à-dire tous les problèmes que j'ai mentionnés, vous voyez que vous n'avez que des hauts. À partir de 70 et jusqu'en 78, vous n'avez que des hauts, vous n'avez rien en bas, ce qui n'était pas le cas jusqu'à présent. C'est pour cela qu'on peut dire éventuellement que la détente a fonctionné, jusqu'à ce qu'il y ait toutes ces actions de confrontation, et donc du coup, on a eu une alternance de haut, de négociation, mais aussi de bas, jusqu'à la fin de la guerre froide. Donc, vous aurez tout le loisir de regarder ceci. Bien, à la semaine prochaine. Voilà, donc à la semaine prochaine. Au revoir.